So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this month's Savvy series on difficult conversations, how to discuss what really matters. I'm Erica Harney, the AFWA Executive Director, and glad you could join me this evening. So what we will do tonight are a few things. We will cover exactly what makes a conversation difficult. What that actually looks like. And then from there, look at 4 areas where conversations become difficult. There are 4 things that I think I've identified that I really think we can work on, those being understanding emotions, action, and communication. And we'll delve into each one of those. So if you're new to the Savvy series, this is a webinar series we put together specifically for women in the business world who work on soft skills. And I really consider being savvy as something that makes you a well-rounded employee slash boss slash business owner, and can really make or break a career if you are not, say, understanding of customers or clients. And a lot of that has to go around communication. And so that's why we developed the Savvy series, was to hit at some hard points around communication and help our members and other women in not only the accounting and finance world, but the business world to handle difficult conversations, for example, but also a wide variety of issues and topics that come up that we experience as women in the business world. So again, if you do have any questions, please post those in the questions box. We'll also have 3 questions that will come up during the entire webinar that are our check-in for our CPE credit. So if you are here for CPE credit, please put your answers in the questions box when those 3 questions come up. We do that so we can gauge your engagement. We can measure engagement during the webinar and be able to offer your CPE credit. So please stay tuned for those. Those will come up. I'll give you plenty of time to answer those. And please put your answers in the questions box. So when we look at conversations and what makes them difficult, these are the 4 areas that I really think as a professional are the areas in which conversations are difficult because of a variety of reasons, and we're going to delve into each of those. First being understanding. So that's where the disagreement or conflict starts, is because you and another person, myself and another person, are not seeing eye to eye, not on the same page. So we have a difference in understanding, and that's where conflict begins. And then sometimes, not always, but I think a lot of times, there are emotions, whether it's on both sides or just us or just them, depends on the situation, come into play, whether that's fear, so even fear of losing a job, fear of retribution, whatever that might be, anger, being frustrated that you just can't move forward on a project or for something. So there are a lot of things around that we'll delve into, and actually emotions is even a whole another webinar that we do with the Savvy series. And so we'll just kind of touch on that just a little bit. And the third one being action. So when we get to a difficult conversation, we're not meeting eye to eye, what's the first thing we want to do? We want to ignore it. We want to put it on the back burner, and that's where procrastination comes in, is we don't want to act on it, whether that's, again, going back to the fear of, or the emotion of fear or anger or frustration. You don't want to put the energy into something, and that's why we procrastinate. And last but not least, and this goes a little bit to understanding, but I think there's a little bit more to it, in terms of communication. So there's a lack of communication or there's miscommunication. So sometimes, no matter how well you try to explain something or provide information, there can always be miscommunication because of how the message is interpreted. And that goes at the heart of communication, a speaker and a listener, and the message that's being heard, and the filters in which we listen to information. So all 4 of these things, there's some component to all 4 of these in a difficult conversation. Now, emotions may be higher than, say, the actions, whether that's procrastination or making decisions or something like that. Understanding could be even greater than, say, the actions and vice versa. So these are the 4 components that I've identified that really make that conversation difficult. And it can be about anything. It can be about money. It can be about relationships. It's a variety. And so when I look at difficult conversations, I try to preface this, and it could be in any venue. So these can be professional, these can be personal, you name it. Conversations can be difficult in general. If you're not getting paid by a client, if you have a disagreement with another volunteer or another staff member, there's always a difficult conversation. So let's delve into the first one of these. So what makes conversation difficult? Understanding, and that could be a disagreement or conflict, points of view. Everybody has them. Everybody also has opinions. And so that's where some things can really start to, I don't want to say dissolve or fall apart, but where gaps can occur. So what is conflict? So the kind of definition of conflict, if you will, there are some distinct pieces of this definition. The first being an expressed struggle. So that being all people involved must know that some disagreement exists. So if you're mad at somebody and they don't know you're mad, that's not necessarily a conflict. But if there's been a little bit of open communication and both sides know that you're not on the same page, you disagree about something, and sometimes disagreement is positive, that is where conflict can start, and that's the, quote, expressed struggle. The next big part of this definition is perceived incompatible goals. So when people perceive their goals to be mutually exclusive, the conflict is real, albeit unnecessary. So whenever you have perceived incompatible goals, that might be your perception, but it might not be the other person's perception. You think that there might be a disagreement, and they may not think that there's a disagreement. So there's a lot there that works, or that you need to work around. The next big part being perceived scarce rewards. So essentially, regardless of the conflict, there's not enough of something to go around. So if you're disagreeing on resources, say, it's money, it's in the budget, and you've got 2 different departments that are, say, in disagreement about where some investment should go, that is around those resources. Then we also have interdependent. So when you look at interdependent, this whole concept of we're all in this together, those are the things, they rely on each other. And that's where, if you're disagreeing on something, but you also rely on each other, say, programs can't move forward without finance, and finance can't really do its work until programs are fulfilled. We're all in it together, but we know that there has to be some sort of collaboration. And then there's also inevitability. So research shows that in both happy and unhappy relationships, there are conflicts. You can be completely happy, but also disagree with somebody. And so we manage those in different ways. And so when we look at conflict, there are a lot of moving pieces. And so we have to understand, when going into conflict or disagreement, what it is that we are facing. So when it comes to conflicts, there are 2 different kinds. We have functional and dysfunctional. So even when we disagree on something, it can still be functional. Both sides work together to come to some sort of agreement or indecision. And so functional conflict is when we look at having, 2 sides or 2 things integrate together to come out with one thing, or we have cooperation, and I've repeated cooperation twice because it's that important. We work with groups that we may not normally work with, and move forward with a shared vision. We also have confirmation and agreement. We just decide that we're going to agree on a end result. Also, in terms of functional conflict, we also have de-escalation. And so that's a really healthy way of recognizing that you may not agree on something, but both sides also see that, okay, let's kind of take this down a notch and calmly discuss things and decide that we're going to come to an agreement. Focusing on the true issue. Sometimes the true problem at hand is buried under a lot of issues and conversation. And so being able to pull out what really is at issue is a really positive way of managing conflict in a functional way. And then last but not least is foresight. So being able to look forward and say, okay, we may disagree now, but maybe in the future we will be able to do X, Y, Z, and that's our goal. So things might be a little bit rocky now and we'll get through them, but in the future, we know where we're headed. When you look at dysfunctional, those are the ones that really put the knot in your gut when it comes to conflict, and really makes everyone want to procrastinate in terms of those actions. So when we look at dysfunctional, we're polarizing. Instead of coming together, we're moving in two separate directions. Same thing with opposition. You're looking at two different viewpoints that are opposing each other, and you're just reaffirming what you think and not listening to the other side. Disconfirmation or disconnection is really looking at, I don't want to say bashing the other side, but not almost being listening to the other side in terms of not validating their opinion and that disconfirmation. And so much so I repeated that one twice too. And coercion. If you're trying to coerce someone rather than get them to agree on something, that's a dysfunctional side of that conflict. And rather than talking people down, you are escalating the conflict, whether it's word choice or points of view or examples. That all escalates emotions, that escalates actions. And that's what makes it dysfunctional. Drifting also, rather than focusing on the need, you start looking at, oh, well, we could do this or we could do that, or how about we move in this direction, as opposed to focusing on what's really important. And then the last but not least, the opposite of foresight being short-sightedness. Rather than knowing or seeing a shared vision, you're looking at the immediate, and the immediate may not be necessarily where you need to go, but with conflict, you just want it to be over, right? So that's where short-sightedness comes into this. And once we have conflict, we have actions, which comes to results. So we can have positive results or we can have negative results. So when it comes to the positive, we can be rewarded for facing a challenge and overcoming it. We can also, really leave that whole conflict feeling better about ourselves, like we actually accomplished something, we moved through something. You were able to have kind of a breakthrough with the other person. We also know that we learn more about the other person and their needs and how each party can be satisfied with what they're looking for. And when you come through a conflict, whatever that might be, personal or professional, your relationship strengthens because you've gone through something. You've addressed a conflict, and you feel like you've come out on the other side knowing a lot more and getting to a shared solution, and the relationship is stronger. And last but not least, you feel like there is a safe environment for you to be able to share. You know that you can share your viewpoint, and people aren't going to take it either personally, or they're going to listen and be able to, accept your viewpoint and integrate it with what theirs is, and you're listening as well. However, what we don't want to see, but happens often, are the negative results of dealing with difficult conversations and dealing with conflict, in which nobody gets what they wanted. So both sides leave feeling and less of what they brought to the table. And then, of course, those who, quote, won the conflict, or today's victor, is likely going to suffer tomorrow at the hands of the original loser. They're going to seek either some sort of retribution or possibly, find other ways in which they can create more conflict possibly. And so, as opposed to both parties leaving satisfied, dysfunctional conflicts threaten the relationship. So if any of you have had a disagreement with, say, a client, that's a big one, that could be the loss of a contract right there with a dysfunctional conflict. And then last but not least, one of the negative results is dissolving a relationship completely. So kind of moving in addition to that dysfunctional conflict, threatening the relationship. So you can have a toxic relationship, but then it completely coming to an end is one of the biggest negative results when it comes to, difficult conversations and conflict. Losing friends, losing clients, losing coworkers, partners, you name it. All of those can be part of dealing with conversations and conflict. So we're going to do our first CPE check-in. So please put in the questions box your answer. What was your last difficult conversation about? And you don't have to be very specific. It can be about a deadline, or just it could be about who's responsible for what. You name it. What was the last difficult conversation that you had with somebody, personal or professional? What was that disagreement and conversation about? You don't have to think too hard, and you don't have to be specific if you don't want to. Was it even just a simple disagreement around, I think this is a big one, around managing money in your family, or even discipline of children if you're parents and you have children and are trying to, come to an agreement around how you discipline children. That's a big one too. So in terms of your last difficult conversation, in what general arena was it about? So please put that in your questions box. And good question from Alice Marie. Yes, you put that in the right box. So questions box, or even in the chat box too. If you have a chat box in your GoToWebinar panel, you should. But questions box is fine, because then only I see them. So please put those in the questions box, and we will be able to process your CPE with that. Some really good examples: undermining of a boss. Another one shared is, and this is a big one I think these days, is understanding some health care and making decisions on behalf of somebody. So again, what was the last difficult conversation about? Please put that in the questions box. I'll give you just another second or two to finish that. And we'll move on to our next section, which is around understanding. It's in that first component of difficult conversations, around understanding, and that conflict styles. And I think this is a big piece that we all have to address, because we have different ways that we deal with conflict. And there's a variety of ways, and I think everybody experiences each of these in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of it depends on the situation and the people involved and so on. So let's jump into some of these. The first one being avoidance or lose-lose, and that's essentially when people ignore or stay away from conflict. You just ignore it, you walk away, you don't say anything. So avoiders put up with status quo. They put up with very unsatisfying relationships. They just go along with it, and that can be, for a variety of reasons. You stay in a position even though you disagree with your boss because paycheck, benefits, what have you. You stay in a relationship because there are kids or there's property or something like that. That's what avoidance is. And there are some positive aspects, if you will, to avoidance, even though we might not necessarily automatically think there are some benefits. But it can help when the risk of speaking out is too great. If you know that addressing a conflict is going to cost you your job or is going to cost you your house or what have you, when something really, really big is on the line, that may require avoidance. So that may be an opportunity in which this might be a way to deal with that conflict. Also, when the conflict isn't worth the effort, if it's just not worth your energy, when you look at the time you're going to have to put into something, you really have to value your time in terms of what it will cost you. Is it going to be worth it in the end to address that conflict? If the answer is no, it's not worth the effort, and you avoid the conflict. And last but not least, if the issue is temporary, if you know, this is something that's going to go away in a month because, the season's over or something like that, avoidance may be the best way to go. Then next, we do have a accommodation, and that's essentially the lose-win when we allow others to have their own way rather than giving our point of view. And sometimes, depending on the relationship, depending on the conflict and the difficult conversation, that can enhance a relationship because you're giving and the other person is taking. And there may be some other point in the future in which, that's reciprocated. And it's important to examine the role that culture plays in accommodation. When you have low context cultures, they view avoidance and even accommodation as positive. So, those cultures who leave a lot on the table to be interpreted, if you will, that's where we view accommodation less positively. So in the United States, we typically, we'll take a lot of this as opposed to, say, other cultures who are a little bit more dictative or authoritarian. That's where we start to see less acceptance of accommodation. Then on the opposite side, we have I win, you lose. So that's essentially a competition way of looking at things. It involves a high concern for yourself. You want to win, and a low concern for others. And this is really ingrained in American culture. And this is essentially, I think a lot of us are raised this way into saying, you must win, 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 win. So we're very competitive. So very much an American point of view. And this whole idea of bidding for control or wanting to win all the time can also breed aggressiveness. It's one thing to be assertive. It's another thing to be aggressive. And so, competition, there can be some times when that is appropriate. That's what works. If you're putting in, say, a bid for an RFP, that's, of course, when competition is a little bit more positive than in other situations. So I think it's something that a lot of us can relate to coming from an American point of view. The next one I think that a lot of us can relate to, especially as women, and which is unfortunate that I can even say that we come to expect this, as passive aggressiveness. And so this is when you, the communicator, express dissatisfaction in a disguised manner. And that's when you see a lot of sarcasm. Sarcasm is built into a lot of comedy, and we think a lot of it's funny, but it can be very passive aggressive. This is also kind of what's labeled as crazy making. We rely on tactics that punish the other person without direct confrontation. But this, can make somebody feel guilty. This also relies on a lot of nonverbal, believe it or not. That's when we have like the loud sighs, the eye rolling, a pained expression. When somebody wrinkles their brow and it's just kind of like smiling at you, but the rest of their face says, "You've got to be kidding me." All that's kind of part of passive aggressiveness. And again, with sarcasm, that's where we see a lot of sarcasm. That's also where we see a lot of humor, because people don't know how to deal with the conflict, and so they make a joke of it. And that's something that I'm not really sure that there's any positive perspective on that, other than maybe learning more about someone's communication style. That I think you can always learn something, but passive aggressive is really hard to have a lesson learned out of that. And I think most of all, you can understand how the other person deals with conflict. Then we also have, aside from passive, what's the opposite of passive? Direct. You've got direct aggression. And so that's when we impose severe impact on the other person, the other organization. And that can come in a variety of formats. So we've seen this with character attacks. I think any election cycle is going to be a perfect example of this. Character attacks, confidence attacks. So-and-so can't do their job. Why would you want them to do or be part of your team? Physical appearance attacks. Somebody's ugly, somebody's too pretty, whatever it might be, too short or too tall, you name it. Wishing bad fortune on people, saying, well, I hope they don't do well. Well, that's pretty direct. And then you've also got, say, teasing, ridicule, and threats to another person. And I honestly cannot find, I know there's a lot of things that we do learn from. Honestly, when it comes to direct aggression, unless it's, say, something that's like life-threatening, or something that is beyond seriousness, something is not going to recover from that, that's when direct aggression, there's just really not a whole lot that's positive from that. But it's a way that some people are going to deal with conflict. And here's the thing that direct aggression, so before you think about direct aggression towards somebody else, there's a severe impact on the other person, other party, other organization, because that verbal aggression can literally have physical impact. We talk about, with self-care and balance, talking about the effects of stress. This is one of those things. When somebody is completely aggressive towards you in a very direct manner, it can be very, very destructive. It can be destructive towards relationships, and you name it. I think there are probably a wide variety of examples of this in our world today, without even naming some of those exact examples. We see it day in and day out, but we also see all the others, which can have some positive outcomes. So coming down from the absolute negative, we have compromise. So compromise is considered essentially a negotiated lose-lose. You're agreeing to give up something on both sides. So both people or parties give some of what they want, not all of it, but they both sacrifice just a little bit to reach the ultimate goal. And so that's how we view compromise. However, here, this is kind of probably a little bit more of an American way of approaching this. Um, the whole idea of compromise does deserve a lot of credit, but there are a lot of times where it doesn't deserve a positive image, or it may not necessarily always be in the best interest to consider compromise. And here's why. Somebody is losing. That's, again, a very American way of viewing it. But if it's something that, say, includes money or share or somebody's power, the costs involved of one part of that lose can be very great. Even personally, if you're nudging just a little, does that compromise your values? Does that compromise a career or your reputation? So sometimes compromise, not always, but sometimes compromise isn't the best way to go. But when compromises are successful, they're categorized as more of collaboration, where both sides get satisfaction out as a result. And this is when we have not only a desire to do well for ourselves, but we're also concerned about the other party. We're not necessarily always looking towards our way of doing things. Now, this is not the most successful or most seen way of dealing with difficult conversations and conflict. So collaboration and that cooperation aspect isn't always what we see. And win-win is not always possible or even appropriate. In a lot of business dealings, a win-win is not a good thing. A win-win may not be appropriate. But it can also be, here's the downside of it, as positive as it can be time consuming. And if you are in a environment where you need to be nimble, this is definitely not the way to go. So when you look at different conflict styles and how you address conflict, there really is not one best way, and it's all relational. It's all dependent upon you and your relationship with the other person. And sometimes we develop a little bit of consistency, but we have to consider a lot of different things. We have to consider the situation, the other person or other party, and say your goals or the company's goals. So our second CPE check-in: what has been the worst way you've handled a difficult conversation? You don't have to be specific if you don't want to about what the conflict was about, but what was the worst way you've handled a difficult conversation? And I think, personally, I think the biggest one has been avoidance. Just walked away, and there was no solution, period. It just hung out there. So what's the worst way you've handled a difficult conversation? Personally, professionally, you name it. I'll give you a few moments to answer that question. And this is one of my favorite Savvy series because there's so much to it. It's very, very dense and a lot to cover. So worst way, a lot of escalation, walking away, avoidance. I think that's what might be for us feeling the worst. So again, if you have an answer, please put that in the questions box. So we're going to move on to the second part of what makes conversation difficult. And that first one is pretty big. So the rest of these are going to be relatively short, although, again, you can make an entire webinar, and we do have an entire Savvy series just around emotions alone. So when we look at emotions, what are they? They can be very complex. These are characteristics that we associate with emotional intelligence, understanding, empathizing, But the other part of that is being very self-aware. How do you understand your own emotions? What are, I hate to say triggers, because I think there's a lot of things that can be a lot more serious than, a specific topic that you just disagree with. But how do you manage your emotions when you have something that you're very passionate about and somebody totally just disses on that? How do you manage that? And in addition to that, we have to look at how sensitive we are to things. When we look at emotional intelligence, we look at the ability to not only identify, but assess and control the emotions of ourselves. We try to control the emotions of others, so say like de-escalation, or in terms of conflict styles, collaboration, and of course groups. The more people you add to a situation, the more it gets a little bit complicated, and that's where we start to give a little or try to find solutions, I think. Now, that's not always the case. So, when we look at emotions, when somebody is crying or mad, can you tell, or do you have, can you tell why they're crying or why they're mad? Or do you really have a hard time reading someone? Those of us who can say, who think that they can read people well, there are some people that don't express emotions, and I don't want to say normally. They just express emotions in a way that is hard to understand or hard to read and hard to empathize with. So emotions really run the gamut. So when we look at emotions, there's a variety of things that happen. So physiological changes, so things that happen to your body, like increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, adrenaline, elevated sugar level, slow digestion. This is like one of those things when we look at emotion and we look at the physical changes. And people mention cortisol, and stress creates cortisol, and that's what creates, gaining weight and all that kind of stuff. That's real. That's what really can happen from conflict and emotions arising. So we have the physiological changes. We also have nonverbal. So when we look at nonverbal, somebody may not be saying something, but the look on their face can be happy, can be sad, can be concerned. And sometimes those nonverbal behaviors can cause emotions rather than reverse them. And sometimes it's really, really hard to determine exact emotions. And we also create a connection between, verbalizing those emotions and the nonverbal reactions. And so when somebody is, smiling ear to ear, but they're telling you something really negative or really sad, it's really hard to determine that exact emotion. And so, what do people do when they're sad? Maybe it's crying. They have a frown on their face. When they're angry, they're furrowing their brow. You can tell when somebody's angry. When they're happy, they're smiling. Their eyes are bright. But when they're anxious, they're kind of biting their lips. They're jittery. And, what's really hilarious to me when it comes to the nonverbal are emoticons. Because some of those can be not always, but sometimes they can be the best descriptors of how we're feeling. And when we can't verbalize it and we're not in front of the person, using those can actually be helpful. We also have how your mind interprets how you feel. So cognitive interpretations, and bodily components of most emotions are similar. So of course, if you're sad, you're frowning. If you're happy, you're smiling. When you look at pre-game jitters, and this also goes into kind of some verbal expression, but when you're really nervous, when you're jittery, sometimes that can be a positive thing if you're envisioning the end goal. Are you going to just nail this presentation? Are you going to win this sell? Are you going to win this game? And that's how we can think about emotions. Even though we're really stressed out, we're really nervous, we can turn those into positive things. So you say, you know what, I'm going to do this. My favorite thing is, when you've got something that's going to last, 4 days, or if you're an audit person or tax person, tax season, hey, I can do anything until April 15th. Hey, I can do anything for 3 days. So that's where we start to kind of help ourselves get through it. And we use specific emotional words to represent intensity. And this is all around emotional intelligence and how we communicate, not only communicate feelings, but also be able to read other people, empathize, be able to put yourself in their shoes kind of deal. We can also think about, in terms of our emotions, how we like to express them. My significant other, he tells me I cannot play poker because it doesn't matter what I say, my face says everything. I can be completely disgusted about something and say, oh, no, that's great, that's wonderful, and my face will tell you otherwise. So you have to really get a grasp on how you express feelings, how you express emotions, and know it's being very, very self-aware. And also those of us who wear, I guess, our heart on our sleeves is the best way to explain it. That can be a little bit of a detriment, or it can be, a little bit of a negative if other people, say, take advantage of that, or they use it to their benefit. But, here's the thing. The key is to express emotions in a, say, positive, constructive manner. They may be negative emotions. You may disagree with somebody, and it's something that's very tense. Say, money's the biggest one of, if you're disagreeing on how to spend money or how to invest money, at least you're putting it out on the table. It's something you may not see eye to eye. You may compromise. But sharing those emotions and saying if you're talking about bills and money, investments, that kind of stuff, and you're expressing your, say, attachment to things or security, sharing those emotions, actually articulating them, can actually improve a relationship. And that can be, personal or professional. And so when I say being very self-aware, it's recognizing your feelings. So being aware of how you feel in certain situations, how certain people make you feel, that's a big one, I think. And able to identify emotions. If I know somebody really gets under my skin, I prepare myself. I know how they act. Sometimes I know why they act the way they act, and am able to kind of adjust how I approach them and conversations. You can also, monitor your physiological changes. You can be very intentional about nonverbal behavior, making sure that you're not fidgeting, or you're not crossing your legs or pacing or something like that. And you also recognize the thoughts and verbal messages of others. So being very intentional about listening and how you interpret what they're saying. So the biggest thing here is to understand how language affects this, and choosing the best language. And you have to make it clear that what you're feeling is centered around certain circumstances, not the entire relationship. So if you're feeling mad, you're not feeling mad and say dissatisfied with an entire relationship, working relationship, with a client, with a significant other. You have to make it centered around a specific circumstance. I'm upset because we didn't reach this goal. Not necessarily, I'm upset because you aren't doing your job. That's being, necessarily, well, there may be truth to that. Again, it depends on the situation. But the problem is that we, as just a society in general, people suffer from an impoverished emotional vocabulary. We have a hard time explaining how we feel without it sounding overly, say, sensitive or overly emotional. So we can think about the ways that we use language and improving it by kind of making it simple, We can say just simply, I'm really angry, I'm really upset, I'm really confused, I'm really happy. And then describe what is happening to you, kind of in a metaphor. What's happening to you physiologically. If something's really eating at you, again, a metaphor, you're really tying your stomach in knots. I always would say, if something was really bothering me, I would always say, well, this is a Tums moment. This is acid reflux moment. This is really kind of making me nervous. I'm concerned, kind of deal. Or you can always describe, what you at this point would like to do. You also have to decide when that's more appropriate. But if you're ready to throw up your hands, sometimes it might be beneficial on the situation to say, you know what, I don't even want to deal with this. I want to give up. And sometimes the other party can understand that and actually help move on instead of, just taking advantage of that. And so you have to make it clear that your feeling is centered around those specific circumstances, again, and not the entire relationship. So make it very specific in how you address it. So our third piece is actions, and in particular, procrastination. We don't want to address emotions. And so productive people sometimes confuse the difference between, say, a reasonable delay and true procrastination. There's sometimes where, and this is a popular one for me, is I need to just sleep on it. I need to marinate on it, is what I normally say. I just need a few hours to kind of just put it off to the side and come back to it. And, some of those can be, when it comes to a reasonable delay, those can be fairly useful. I'll respond to this email when I have more time to write it and be more thoughtful. When you have those moments where you just want to write off a quick response and completely explode at the other person. Or when it comes to true procrastination, it's very self-defeating. Instead of saying, I'll come back to this email when I'm, in the right mind to answer it, versus I should respond to this email right now, and I have time, and I'm sitting right here, and the internet's working just fine. I have no excuse, and I don't have anything else to do right now, but I just don't feel like it. That's true procrastination. And, procrastination honestly has nothing to do with time management. That will probably boggle some people's minds, but procrastination has nothing to do with time management. It all has to do around something you either feel like doing or don't feel like doing. And so to tell the chronic procrastinator to just do it isn't going to be helpful. So, sometimes it's more of, rather than telling them to, quote, just do it, providing a solution, working with them to get through it. Procrastination is a hard thing. It's a hard way to work through stuff. But beating procrastination when it comes to, those difficult conversations can be very helpful in helping the other person. And there are ways that we can do that. So we can set a deadline and say, okay, I know you're having a hard time with this. And even, Debbie, who works for AFWA, has said, here's our deadline. You need to give me X, Y, Z by this deadline. That helps. So I can't put it off anymore. You can also help the other person kind of delineate out. So to get from point A to point B, this is what we need to do. But also understand your emotions that come into play when you just don't want to do something. Why don't you want to do it? That might be related back to feelings of inadequacy, or, you just feel like you can't do it, all in the kind of self-deprecating way of looking at things. There can be a variety of ways, but you need to be honest with yourself. And when I say write down all of these things, not only the deadline and the steps, but also how you're feeling about it. Why don't you want to do it? Really dig down deep. And if you can understand that, you can overcome it. So I'm sometimes, depending on the thing, the biggest procrastinator in the world because I don't want to do it. It's not fun. It's not fun for me, but it's a necessary thing. So, there are ways to overcome it. Find a partner that will help you get through the procrastination. So, last but not least, we have communication. When it comes to difficult conversation, so when we look at communication or lack thereof, those two being two different things. And so which is it? We look at lack of communication, so something that's never said. We also look at uncertainty when we let emotions or conflict go into lack of communication. Also lack of communication when you're not telling a group of people the solution, or you're not telling people. This happens a lot in companies where you're not telling the employees what's going on. That's when people start making up answers as to what's going on. So that's where the rumor mill starts. That's when gossip starts. However, miscommunication can come from a variety of things. What I said is not what you heard. So that could be around vocabulary. It could be around messy, quote, messy speaking. You're not being concrete. You're kind of dancing around and putting more words to things than you might need to. Faulty definitions. What you understand blue to be may not be how I understand blue to be. Something that's big in, say, the accounting, finance, or just any industry anymore is language around acronyms, buzzwords, oh my goodness, jargon. If it's specific to your industry, if you can avoid it or at least preface things by saying, okay, this is what this means, so you don't have that miscommunication. Legalese, I think, is one of the perfect examples of where we can start to have miscommunication. So when it comes to having the difficult conversation, these are the things you can think about. So when it comes to purpose and goal, what's your purpose for having the conversation? What do you want to get out of it? What are you hoping to accomplish? What's ideal for you? Think about what may be ideal for the other person. Take yourself and put yourself in their shoes. Also watch for hidden purposes or hidden agendas. You may think that you have very honorable goals like educating an employee or increasing, say, connection with your kid, only to notice that your language is being critical or condescending. You may think you want to support, but then you end up punishing. So some purposes are more useful than others. You have to work on yourself so that you enter into the conversation with a supportive purpose. So be very intentional. Literally write out, that's what helps for me, is just literally writing things out. Also looking at assumptions. Have you made assumptions about this person's intentions? So think about all the things they've said and what you've said. Are you interpreting something? Are you assuming? And so you may feel, say, intimidated, ignored, belittled, disrespected, but be cautious about assuming that that was their intention. Like, oh my goodness, this person hates me. Maybe that's not necessarily the case. Maybe they're just very passionate about something, and so what they say comes across as hatred or, being condescending. So impact does not necessarily equal intent. When you look at, what's being hard, what are your buttons that are being pushed? Are you more emotional than the situation warrants? Which does happen. So don't feel bad if that happens. Look at the backstory. Is there something personal in your background or experience that's being triggered? You may still have the conversation, but at least you'll go into it knowing that there's some sort of heightened emotional state within you that you're coming to the table with. Also, say attitude. How is your attitude toward the conversation influencing your perception of it? If you're going to go into it with a negative attitude, which I know we all have, it's going to be difficult. So if you truly believe that whatever happens or some good will come out of it, then it will likely be the case. So try to adjust your attitude to get the outcome that you're looking for. It's very easy to go into it saying, well, this is a no-win situation. You don't know, and you're making assumptions. Then also look at, who are you in a conversation with? Who's the, quote, opponent? I don't necessarily like that word, but who are you having a conflict with? And so what might be the other person's thinking around the situation? How are they viewing it? Can you look at the problem through their lens? How do you think they perceive it? What are this person's needs, and what solutions do you think they will suggest? What do you think it is that they might have in their heads that they want to achieve? That will at least help you come to some sort of agreement, whether it's win-lose, lose-lose, win-win, what have you. Are there anything, or is there anything that you are concerned about? Fear, you have great fear that you may have, lose job, lose retribution, lose a client, what have you. Or what could there be? And last but not least, you have to be honest with yourself and look at, how have you contributed to the problem? Have you started rumors? Have you said things that you've made assumptions about? So, be honest with yourself. You may not have to share all of that, but at least being honest with yourself as to how you've contributed to that. So when we approach conflict and difficult conversations, there's a 7-step approach that I really like. It's from Rader and Whiter-Hatfield, and these are pretty simple. So needs, share your needs with the other person. So choose, a suitable time and place, something that might be neutral. Use I language. That, I think, is the biggest thing ever, is to say, this is how I feel. This is my opinion. This is my perspective. You've also got, sharing your needs. I really need to look at this from a positive perspective, and we need to figure out something. We need to move on. Listen to the other person, and not just hear, but actually listen. Take notes if you have to. If you're one of those people, you got to write everything down, which I am. And then talk with the person to come up with a solution in terms of listing all of them out. Just kind of in terms of that brainstorming, like, don't knock any of them. Just get them all on paper, and then figure out which is the best for both parties. And then, pretty simple, implement them and then follow up. You might find that what you initially chose from all of those possible solutions may not be the best solution, so you come back to it and find another solution. So, hope that it's been helpful. I have our last CPE check-in. Just a quick question around just if we offered CPE credit for watching a recorded webinar. So if you could not attend tonight live, would you participate, say, in a self-study? You would watch the video and you would take, quote, a quiz, so kind of similar questions that if you weren't watching it live, you would answer in a quick, like, survey or quiz. And if you participate in self-study already, depending on the content and the organization that's providing it, if you do participate in self-study CPE with another organization or your company, what do you enjoy most about it? Is there a particular benefit that you enjoy from self-study? So if we were to offer self-study versus, well, not necessarily versus live, but in addition to live, if you had the option of not being on a webinar at 8 p.m. Eastern, I know we spread them out. We try to do a day and evening kind of thing, but if something may not work for your schedule, would you do a self-study? If the topic were what you were looking for, would you do self-study? So I'll leave you a few moments to answer that question. And so while I leave it open for you to answer that question, do you have any questions? If you do have specific questions that I can help you with, please put those in the questions box. And while you do that, just a quick reminder about the upcoming conference, our Women Who Count conference. I can't tell you how excited. We've pretty much finalized the program this week, and it is going to be awesome. So if you can join us in DC, even if for one day, please consider that and put those dates on your calendar if you have not already. If you're on social media and haven't connected with us, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Good question on the CPE check-in questions. The second question was, I think it, well, as I go through all of my notes, I believe it was, what was the worst, found it. What has been the worst way you've handled a difficult conversation? So that was our second one. If you didn't get a chance to answer that one, what is the worst way in which you've handled a situation? And so I'll leave it open to any questions. We've reached 9 o'clock, actually 9:01. So if you have to run, thank you for joining us tonight. Please put in any questions, or if you have questions at a later time, please feel free to drop those in an email or give us a call, and we'll answer those to the best of our ability or find an answer for you. So thank you all for joining me this evening. I appreciate your time and your efforts and your willingness to listen to this content and desire to listen to the content. I hope this has been extremely helpful in some way, shape, or another. If you've even learned one thing, I think that's phenomenal. So I hope you all have a fantastic weekend, and thank you again for joining us, and hope to see you on the next Savvy series in July. It's going to be a great topic, and if I could remember what that is off the top of my head, I would tell you. But if you haven't registered, it's on the members portal for AFWA members, and it's on Eventbrite for those who are not AFWA members. So again, thank you. Have a great weekend. I'll stick around for your questions if you have them. Otherwise, have a great evening. Thank you.